Okay. So Connor, whenever you're ready, we'll start. Just let me know when you're ready.
Recording in progress.
I am just grabbing some of my materials here. Thankfully, most of them are on our website. So sure, thank you, Jackie. The first thing we have is just, I think our first meeting as a subcommittee since the preliminary budget for FY23 was released. I wasn't planning on re-presenting it here unless folks want me to try to quickly tear through that. I know probably at least half of the people here have already seen that once or twice. It was distributed to all the boards and committees and department heads back in February. So I'm operating under the assumption everyone here has received it and had time to take a look. I can give a broad overview, Jackie. I don't know if anyone wants to just kind of get into specific questions about our position and what we're looking at for next year.
Yeah, if you wouldn't mind giving a broad overview and then seeing if anyone else had more specific questions, that would be very helpful. Thank you.
Sure. So first cut of the budget, typically we deliver that in February. The preliminary projected revenue for next year is just over 96 million with our estimated expenses at about 97.5. So we're starting with a $1.1 million deficit. That's not outside the realm of what we're all used to and what we've all seen quite a bit. Although it will not be without challenge closing it. So at the risk of sounding like a broken record, everyone here is quite familiar with the long-standing structural challenges that we have. Most significant of which is the kind of chronic underinvestment in state aid. This is a problem that somewhat fell out of narrative focus, my own narrative focus the past 2 years, because obviously we were kind of on complete disaster response during COVID. But during COVID, in the first year, fiscal 21, we were all very happy just to not have it cut. It was level funded. And then it grew by about 3%. And now that we're heading into 23, the third budget, if you could believe that since COVID, we can really take stock of the fact that the level funding in fiscal 21, the marginal increase in 22, in the current proposal, which is, again, minimum aid for schools, which is $30 per student, which amounts to 0.7% this increase to the schools, coupled with a 2.7 for unrestricted general aid for the government, puts us, I think, just over 1% for state aid, and it really is, it focuses how much of a chronic problem this is for us. This is something all of us have spent a lot of time and energy discussing and advocating for and lobbying. Everyone here, I believe, has seen a copy of the letter to our delegation from the town and schools, highlighting some of the real particulars of the underfunding here and what it means for Easton. But the real focus, not just for Easton, but for all minimum aid districts, which we learned is about a third in Massachusetts, so it's not just us, is that in the current climate, the Commonwealth is going through a very, very different governmental revenue situation than we are. Since COVID, state level revenues, many of them are much more attached to spending levels, things like sales taxes, unlike our primary revenue generator, which is property tax, and it's very inelastic. It's 2.5% of the levy and growth. State revenues have grown by about 30% in the past couple of years, which is unbelievable and historic for the state. And for many, many, many years under Governor Baker's administration, the state has engaged in basically a verbal compact with municipal governments that whatever the increased state revenue is projected for next year is what they would increase unrestricted aid by. And that was mostly on track 2015 to 2020. And in the 3 fiscal years since, state revenue has exploded far beyond what budget makers on the state level had ever anticipated. And in that same dynamic, while they've gone up 30%, we're looking at a 3-year increase to unrestricted aid of about 6%. So the divide is enormous. And the current budget proposal on the state level, Governor Baker's fiscal 23 proposal, only recommends a 2.7% increase to this category. The Mass Municipal Association is asking for closer to 7.5%. There's a lot of reasons why that is rather than 20%, but the long and short of it is that you can take away from the current situation is there will likely never be another economic climate like the one we're in, where the Commonwealth has seen such a enormous increase in revenue. And if against that backdrop, they can't and won't increase minimum aid from $30 to $100 per student, which has been being requested by the MMA for years. And if in that economic backdrop, they will not increase unrestricted aid, which are two of the only ways that the Commonwealth could assist minimum aid districts like Easton and the 130 plus other school districts in the towns that they work with, that opportunity, that door is probably just closed. And we should begin to think very seriously about what that means and for the community. So this is a very familiar problem. I'm not intending to make it sound dramatic, but if not now, then when is a really good way to look at it. So what we're looking at there is that the second largest source of our revenue just continues to shrink. It used to be 25% of our revenue before the 2008 financial crisis. It's going to be less than 15% of our revenue next year. In the intervening years, we have filled that hole almost exclusively with taxation, and that's because we don't have that many other tools that we can lean on. We've seen state aid grow basically, not basically, but $750,000 in 15 years. So it's just not working, and it's going to continue to put a huge strain on our recurring revenue growth opportunities, which then makes every budget year a bit of a slog and puts us in this posture of sounding like a broken record, where we have this really tough hill to try to climb over every year. I think it's instructive to look. If you have the budget memo, we have some, I think, helpful graphs in there. If you look at what state revenue to Easton was back in 2008 before the economy collapsed, getting rid of any kind of actual increases, if you just take that number and adjust it for inflation, we're $3 million lower than that right now. So think about, for many of you, how many budgets you've sat through and heard me talk about a structural revenue deficit. Even when COVID hit, we've never had a preliminary deficit that was $3 million. So if state aid had just kept pace with inflation, even setting aside the kind of crazy environment we're in right now, even before current inflation rates, that gap was $2 million. Every year we start with $1 to $2 million gap, and that's not an accident, right? So it's really, if we don't see this change this year, when there is such a large surplus of revenue on the state level from prior year closeouts, and in the state's defense, they do have things they need to do, like rebuild their reserves that they leaned on during COVID and all that. But if in this climate they're not going to meaningfully shift the needle or change how minimum aid is funded, then I really think that bodes poorly and says that we need to look inward and locally on how we're going to deal with these things, whether we want to or like to or not. Some good news, our reserves are in very good shape. We've worked very hard. Everyone on this subcommittee and their respective departments and boards have worked very hard and been very committed to some really good financial policies we've adopted as a team years and years ago. And so we are only this year reaching the fund balance policy we've had for 6 years, which is that, an ideal, a rule of thumb is that you want your reserves, your free cash, and your stabilization to equal roughly 10% of what it takes to run your general fund for a year. So we've reached that, which is good. The other side of that is, given what I just said about state aid, the likelihood is that we are going to have to start leaning on those one-time dollars more than we have in the past few years to sustain services at the level that they're at. The preliminary expense budget at this point is exactly that. It's preliminary. At this point, we usually just have a placeholder for the school budget as the schools work through their own process. That placeholder is 4%. The town side is preliminary. It's for like 3.8. On the town side, it's almost exclusively level service, level staff. There's 1 or 2 adjustments there that I'll be working with Wendy and some department heads on, assuming they can make the cut as we try to close the gap. The main drivers are fixed costs, as is typical. Some large ones, debt and interest. You have obviously the Blanche James project, but again, the good news there is that that's zeroed out by exempt revenue on the other side of the ledger. We had a 5% placeholder for increase to health insurance for active and retirees, active employees and retirees. That is actually the GIC rates have come in. It's going to roughly be in that area. It probably won't be over our estimate, which is good, but obviously we would have preferred to see that give us some room to come down a little bit. We're still waiting on other liability and property casualty insurance figures, and we are still refining the snow and ice budget. There will be a deficit there. We carried an assumed 150,000. Hopefully it's not that full 150,000. So there may be a little bit of wiggle room for us to reduce the deficit overall slightly, right? If we have a $1.1 million deficit, 150 grand of that is snow and ice. So hopefully we can get some relief there. And we're waiting on final assessments regionally from Bristol Aggie, which are shifting and increasing. Although they are small in raw numbers, they have gone through a debt exclusion process. Everyone's very busy with construction. And the way that works is that the debt service is split up on a per pupil basis and assessed out to communities. So that's a lot of talking about numbers without visual aid. So I apologize for that, but if I pulled up a PowerPoint, you all would have been here for 40 minutes. So tried to hit the highlights there. Any feedback or questions? I hope no one does need to correct me. This went out to everyone, so I hope this is not people's first hearing this. So what, if anyone has any questions or feedback, happy to try and be helpful.
No questions, comments, size?
Okay. Jackie, it's Caroline. A quick
Go ahead.
comment.
Go ahead, Caroline.
Connor, I thought that what you wrote to submit to our legislators was phenomenal. I'm sure you had help from Leisha and others, but it was very compelling. Honestly, I'm not sure that it could have been the most compelling piece in the world. I'm not sure that it'll move them, but it was really, really outstanding. So thank you for you and your team for doing that.
Yep, thank you. No, and yes, Dr. Cabral and folks helped for sure, particularly with the specific legislative areas outside of just requesting funding where schools, therefore all of us could be assisted. You know, this also has been a much higher focus for the Mass Municipal Association, as you know, they typically have areas where they, you know, every year, and it starts to feel perfunctory, just like it can for us, I'm sure, where say, hey, you know, level funding road funds for 20 years doesn't really do a great job of keeping our roads in good shape. But they really have elevated and spent a lot of their energy on the minimum aid communities this year in a way that I have not seen them do. And on the revenue share aspect, I'm on their fiscal policy committee. This is something that lots of folks are pointing out, you know, this kind of, if not now, then when? Because it's a legitimate fear of municipal managers that if we can't see a more equitable revenue share in this environment, then we are more on our own than we would like.
Actually, I do have a question. You know, I know that we hear all the time that the federal government receives much more in income taxes from Massachusetts than we get back in federal aid. I'm assuming that is probably a similar situation for the state, but do we pay more in state taxes than we get back in aid? Does the people? It'd be interesting. Well, it'd be interesting to know that. You know, just curious if there's anybody that has talked about that. You know, because we know that about the federal government that Massachusetts pays a lot more in tax than we receive in aid from the federal government. But I just was curious to know if that was reflected also for Easton, sort of comparably in relation to the state aid. But okay, that'd be interesting to try to look into. Thank you.
Any other questions on this before we move on to the next item?
Jackie, just before we move on, I too do not have any of the attachments. I've looked about 5 times now, both in the meeting invite. If Michael could just forward those to me as well.
Yes, actually, he replied all to us, and the PDFs should be in an email to your town account. Did that not make it to you?
No, I just checked. Not there.
I got it at 4:01, Jamie. It's in a calendar invite. That helps.
I just re-forwarded it as a plan.
Yeah, I have the calendar invites, but the attachments are not there.
I'll put them in a separate email and I'll try forwarding it that way.
There was also one, I'm trying to see what time mine came in earlier today.
Jamie, did you give the one I just sent?
Yeah, there was one on March 16th too that I got.
I just got Michael's.
Okay.
Okay.
Oh, all set. Thanks, Michael.
I had a quick question for either Connor and or Wendy. Thank you both for all the work that you have done in putting this together. I just had a quick question on the collective bargaining reserve. And it's the reserve that we have for FY23 is $150,000. And can you explain what is that for? What's the reserve for? Sure.
So that is a holdover. So in the past, what we have done on the town side, Alicia, correct me if I'm wrong, the schools have always tried to basically plan for what that impact of bargaining will be in their budget proposal. The town has, in the past, put budgets forward reflective of the carryover of current agreements after they expire, and then set aside a certain amount of funds based on assumed cost of living or other financial impacts in a reserve. This year, for a few reasons, one is so we can have better and more accurate comparisons of budget requests. The other is to also just be clear and communicative with our unions what our financial capacities are. The town has basically just copied the schools, and we've plugged in assumed cost of living into our departmental budget ask. So that reserve at this point is smaller than what bargaining costs would be for a town or school side, but for now it is there. If we can afford to keep it there and balance the budget, it would be helpful, given that we are in, without saying too much, given we're all actively negotiating, we're in a challenging economic environment.
Okay, thank you. And then there are a couple other places where we had some decreases. For example, county and state assessments.
Well, let me just pull it up. Are you looking at the detail spreadsheet or a summary from the memo?
Probably the summary from the memo.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, I see. So the county and state assessments a decrease of $34,000. Wendy, is that driven by something in particular?
Yes, that's mostly due to a decrease in the charter school assessment.
Okay.
So on the summary, it's just one total for state and county assessments, but there's probably like 10 or 12 different line items that make that up, and one of them is the charter school assessment, and that has gone down. I think you'll also see.
Before you go to the next one, so in plain English, it really means that less of our students are being assessed to be placed at charter schools or wanting to go to charter schools. Is that it, or no?
Yes, yeah, you could have had some students that graduated too. Okay. And they just weren't replaced with others, with other students from Easton attending charter schools. Yes, but I believe it's due to a decline in enrollment. And you'll also notice that in the state aid category on the line item budget summary, the charter school reimbursement also went down by $28,000.
Okay. Okay, and then the last question has to do, there was also a decrease for the police department. I think I saw that. A small amount. Gosh.
So the police line is reflective of retirements and replacement of newer officers who come in at a lower step early in the career.
Okay, perfect. Okay, thank you.
Great, thank you. Do you want to move on to the American Rescue Plan Act update?
Sure. So as the subcommittee knows, we published a draft ARPA plan back in December. We presented it at that time, and we also published a survey from the public that we've been advertising, that we've had some folks engage with, which is good. Since the publication of that draft, what has transpired are a few helpful things. One is that the United States Treasury has finalized their regulations for the rule, which is helpful because it's basically the roadmap that we need to follow in order to make sure that we are spending those funds in an eligible manner. And also since then, Bristol County, who is receiving $2 of every $3 of potential federal funds that Easton is eligible for, has finalized their application process that is built very closely on that U.S. Treasury final rule. Since then, we have begun building applications to a portal. We've received funding for the first one of those, which was one of the more straightforward requests, which is to look at replacing one of the positions of the police department that was cut in fiscal 21 to balance the budget in the face of COVID. And we're working now with the county, specifically with CLA, and the way that the county distributes funds is different than how we receive it from the state. So ARPA funds directly to a municipal government from the Commonwealth basically come as a forward payment. They deposit it into your account. You sign off on Treasury rules that say you understand you have to follow those regulations and you'll be liable for audit. The county basically audits you on the front end. You file an application, you tell them which of the eligible expenditure categories you're looking to use, and they send it through 2 layers of review, a legal review and a financial review with audit firms to ensure that if they're going to distribute those funds down to the municipal level, that when the county is later audited, that they've crossed their T's and dotted their I's. So we've had one simple application go through and get funded. We're now working on what's probably on the opposite end of the spectrum, which is one of the more complicated applications from a regulatory standpoint, which is to seek funding for the Taxation Aid Committee to do direct financial assistance to low and moderate income homeowners in Easton. And Wendy has been working with CLA on that. We, I believe, have filed the application, Wendy.
It's in process.
Okay. And we have been getting good feedback from CLA, and basically the rationale here is we feel pretty good that if we get this filed and their auditors sign off on this, then the rest of our planned programming, which is more of a clear-cut request under the Treasury rules, will be a relatively smooth process. So we're working to do this more complicated one now. Hopefully that's filed and we get some feedback within a week. Next week, Winnie and I plan to sit with Dr. Cabral and Marilyn and start pulling together the materials we need to file the requests with Bristol County for funding for the educational programming that was in the ARPA plan, full day K funding, tutoring, things of that nature. So generally, now that we know what the county rules are, our thinking at this point is to lean on the direct funds that we have for the municipal revenue replacement allocation in light of what we touched on with state revenue challenges and things like that, and to seek for programmatic funding through the county, because by doing that, we ensure that we are basically getting a free audit on the front end to make sure that we are compliant. So that's where we're at. I'm thinking that as we go through working with the county and hit our stride that come summer, I will work to do a revised report based on our spending and incorporate feedback from the public that we received since as well.
Connor, is there a general timeline or a time that the county gives you when you put in an application, when they're going to let you know whether they will reimburse funding or whether they want more information, or is it just, we're just going to have to wait and see because it's all new process?
So they go through a few layers, and so they have the kind of technical review on the front end working with CLA and the auditors, and CLA really takes care of making sure that all the technical and reporting compliance pieces are done on the front end before it even gets to the commission. After it makes its way through that process, which with the more simple one I referenced took a few weeks, then they put it forward to a county commissioners meeting where they vote on the funds. We actually did not know at the meeting at which they were voting that first one, and they voted it, and we got an email that said you were approved, and then we received a check. So it works through that technical layer first. As we do the more project-specific ones, particularly the larger and important ones like Folder K, we're going to try and make sure that we can be available for the night, even if it's compliant technically. We want to make sure that we are available to go to the commission meeting in case they have questions, so we can advocate for it. But that was a long way of saying, no, they don't give you an exact, we'll have it turned around in 1 week.
Okay, thank you. Are there any other questions? Okay, Caroline?
Connor, it's Caroline. Is there still a sense that the county intends to basically do it on a population basis and in as fair a way as possible? Is there still a sense that that is the approach?
Yes, so they voted, I don't know when they voted for per capita, but they are using a per capita distribution, and I believe they're actually using 2020 census figures, which is beneficial to Easton because our population grew in the past decade. So they are doing it on a per capita basis, and they voted last Labor Day approximately that it is their intent that 90% of what they are receiving would be made available and dispersed, assuming eligible projects, to cities and towns within the county.
I remember you saying that. I just wanted to be sure you hadn't heard anything different since then. So thank you.
Sure.
Any other questions on ARPA? Okay, great. Then let's go on to the joint budget hearings with the Select Board and FinCom for April 25th and 27th.
Sure. So we, by charter, every spring leading up to the annual town meeting, have to have at least one joint hearing between the Select Board and Finance Committee for all the departments, including the school committee and the regional schools, to submit and give a presentation on their proposed budgets. We try to get every single department in and out over the span of 2 nights of hearings, which is efficient given how many people are involved, but it also can take a good amount of time. So we try to schedule it well in advance. My staff checked with Finance Committee through their chair and checked with Dr. Cabral and school staff to make sure that folks are generally available one or both of those nights. So 25th will be a Monday. The hearing, I think, starts at 7, but we'll send confirmations to everyone. And then the 27th is a Wednesday. Again, I think that's a joint hearing that opens at 7 o'clock so that we can go through that process and have everyone present their departmental budgets. Over time, Wendy and I, in thinking about it with department heads, these used to take place in March, actually right around this week. And for all of us who've been doing this for a while, you know that we're never at a balanced budget this early. So we feel it's more productive. You'd hate to ask a department head to come in and present a budget that you then have to go cut. So we think it's better to have that presentation closer to the end of April, because we usually get to a point of funding or balancing the budget by the end of April or early May.
Any questions or comments? Okay, great. Annual town meeting is coming up on May 16th. Connor?
Sure. So everyone, same distribution list, should have received the first draft of the warrant for town meeting. So it is 33-ish articles, a lot of CPA and zoning this spring, a lot of good programs and investments from CPA. And then your normal business on the first half of the warrant, dealing with budget, capital budget. Everyone has had it, I believe. I don't want to bore everyone and read through each article individually, but does anyone have any questions about the warrant, any of the projects there? Obviously, the budgets are placeholders for now. We never put the exact numbers in until we have a balanced product.
Questions, comments? Okay. So status reports from boards and committees, and I just want to remind if anyone's here for the meeting that they can put comments in the Q&A feature, but you need to put your name and your address in it for your question to be read. Thanks. All right, let's start with select board. Jamie, Jennifer, anything that you want to fill us in on?
Yeah, I'll just mention that the Municipal Building Committee, which actually is meeting tomorrow night, and invited a number of people last week. We did select a designer, so we're moving forward with, and a number of people on this call were on the meeting as well. But so we've had really good progress there in hopes of getting it in front of the select board meeting. And correct me if I'm wrong, Connor, I think next Monday, the 28th.
That's right.
So if anyone's interested in reading or doing that meeting, I believe that was televised as well. I thought it was a really thoughtful and thorough interview of the two candidates, the two finalists, and ultimately the one chosen, I think everyone agreed was the technically most proficient, and there's been some history with that company in town. So it was a really good meeting all around.
Yeah, it was very informative. Jen, anything?
I have nothing to add. Thank you.
All right, thanks. Shireen or Mike, do you have anything you want to tell us about FinCom?
Shireen, I'm going to defer to you because I wasn't at this past week's meeting.
Okay, sure. Our committee right now, we're in the process of meeting with department heads to review the budgets and just do a due diligence. We don't have our next scheduled meeting as of yet. And as you heard earlier, we met with Connor and Wendy last week and we reviewed preliminary budgets and asked questions. Other than that, I think we're going to be doing a tiny training for new members on government financing or finances 101 rather, just so that, you know, they're a little bit familiar with some of the vocabulary that we use. For example, free cash. What is that?
That's a great idea that you're doing that. I think that's great.
Yeah, so that's about it. Thank you.
Schools. So Dr. Cabral, Marilyn, Caroline, if anyone wants to say anything. I mean, I'm just going to say, come walk through the new school because that's the favorite part of my week. It's awesome.
Yes, if anybody's interested in a tour of the building, it is an active construction site, so you have to wear active construction site clothing. Contact us in central office. We do tours Wednesday at 10 a.m. dependent on weather, of course, the particular projects that are going on at the time and how many people are already on the tour, because there is a cap on the number of people we can take through safely. The building project itself is on time and remains under budget at this point, so that's all good news. And in terms of the operating budget, we have 6 bargaining units. We are actively in negotiations with 1 right now. The rest will follow, and then about 40 individual contracts or so. So 80% of our operating budget, a little over 80% of our operating budget is human resources. And so we are appreciative that we're not having that budget conversation until the end of April. Not sure if we'll have a lot more information at that point, but certainly hope to get further because clearly the negotiations are directing, are going to be directing 80% of our budget. So we hope to have that information in time for the April meeting, the April hearing, excuse me.
Thank you, Dr. Cabral. Anything else? Nope. Okay, we'll move on to the meeting minutes of December 8th, 2021. Does anyone have any questions or comments? I'll take a motion for approval.
O'Neill, so moved.
Do I have a second?
Second, Stebbins.
Thank you. I'll do a roll call vote. Stebbins?
Stebbins, yes.
Stacy?
Stacy, yes.
O'Neill?
O'Neill, yes.
DePietro?
Andreas,
Diaz?
Yes, yes.
Reed?
Reed, yes.
Cabral?
Yes.
Wiseman, yes. Okay, thank you. Setting of the next meeting.
So we intend to give a budget update on April 11th, and then we have departmental hearings on the 25th and 27th. So I don't know if Jackie, you and the subcommittee think it's necessary to meet in between those. I know it's a busy time of year, but that's up to the group.
I mean, I think with all of that, we don't necessarily have to meet. I mean, if anyone else has any other ideas, please speak up. I think if anything changes, if there's any significant developments, if anything changes with the ARPA funding, any update that you need to give us, something like that, we could always set something up last minute.
That's fine. Everyone on this would be copied on any of those updates. So if Jackie, you feel you'd like to call them, you certainly can.
Anyone have any other thoughts on that? Nope. Okay, public participation. Let's see what we got. There is a question in here, but as I said before, we need your name and your address to read any questions. So if you want to submit that before we adjourn, that would be fine, but otherwise we can't read it. My name and it says my name and address are here, but I don't see anything. All I see is owner on all of them. Let me see if I can see anything else. I don't know, Michael, if you see anything different.
No, I don't see a name or address submitted.
Okay. So thank you for putting something in, but we really need your name and address in order to be able to read any of your questions or comments. And I don't see that here yet. So, okay. Oh, wait, here's another one. Okay, thank you so much. So does anyone have a motion for adjournment?
Moved.
Do I have a second?
Second, yes, second.
Thank you. Roll call. Stebbins?
Stebbins, yes.
Stacy?
Stacy, yes.
O'Neill?
Yes.
DePietro?
yes.
Diaz?
Yes, yes.
Reed?
Yes.
Cabral?
Yes.
And Wiseman is yes. So thank you all. Have a good night.
Okay.
You as well.
Good week.